They buried her son with full military honors, but never told her it was happening. No phone call, no letter. Not even her name in the obituary. She found out from a neighbor's newspaper. When she showed up to the church, they turned her away. At the door. But what the Navy SEALs did next changed everything. This isn't just a story about grief. It's about the quiet power of a mother's love. The truth that outlives ceremony, and a final salute that wasn't listed in any program. Why was she a race stand? How did her son make sure she was never forgotten? The kitchen radio hummed softly in the background, tuned to a static-heavy AM station that played old country songs no one requested anymore. The coffee had gone cold in her mug an hour earlier, but she hadn't noticed. Lately, time had become a blurred days without shape, hours without purpose. She stared at the faded envelope on the table. It was a utility bill, not a letter, not a call, not the thing she had been waiting for without realizing it. Her name was Mary Ann Cooper. 52 years old, a nurse by trade, a mother by everything that mattered. She had raised her son, Daniel, almost entirely alone through ear infections, midnight fevers, scraped elbows, and broken hearts. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year, not since his last deployment. But the last time they spoke, his voice had been steady, calm. He said he was okay. He always said that the knock on the door startled her. It was Mrs. Hensley from across the street, clutching her newspaper like it was a secret she hadn't meant to read. "I'm so sorry, Mary Ann," she said before even stepping inside. "I didn't know how to. I just thought you should see this." She laid the newspaper on the table and pointed to the bottom half of page A7. There, nestled between a classified ad for a used Ford and a lost dog notice, was the funeral announcement. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper, United States Navy SEAL, killed in action. Funeral to be held at St. Mark's Church, Saturday, 10 a.m. closed casket service. Family and friends welcome. Mary Ann didn't speak. She read it once, then again. Her eyes moved across the lines mechanically, as if comprehension would eventually arrive if she just stared hard enough. But it never did. There was no mention of her. No note saying survived by his mother, Mary Ann Cooper. No listing of her name at all. "They didn't call me," she finally whispered. "Not the military. Not anyone." Mrs. Hensley looked uncomfortable. She fidgeted with her wedding ring. "Maybe they thought you already knew. Maybe his wife, his widow. Maybe she handled the notifications." Mary Ann blinked. "She has my number." She said it more to herself than to her neighbor. That fact hung in the air like a cracked window letting in cold air. She had spoken with Daniel's wife only a few times. Tense conversations. Brief. Ever since the wedding 3 years ago, things had shifted. The distance widened. Daniel's visits home had become shorter, the calls less frequent, but still he had called. He had never shut her out completely. At least she had thought that there had been no call this time. Not from the Navy, not from his commanding officer. No flag-bearing officer at her door. No chaplain with solemn eyes. Just a neighbor with a newspaper and shaking hands. "I should have been told," Mary Ann said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was flat, hollow. She wasn't sure yet what to feel. Grief hadn't reached her only, the disbelief. The early stage where the mind floats just above reality. Unwilling to land, she reached out and traced her son's name on the paper with her finger. The ink smudged slightly under the pressure. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Hensley repeated, her voice small. "Do you want me to stay?" "No," Mary Ann said softly. "No, thank you." When the door closed again, the house went still. The only sound was the soft crackling of the radio. A George Strait song faded into static. She picked up the newspaper again and read the line about the funeral, Saturday. 2 days away, it hadn't occurred to her that she wouldn't be invited to her own son's funeral, that someone would make that decision for her. That grief could arrive by accident slipped between a grocery coupon and a sports column. Delivered by a neighbor and opened like unwanted mail. She folded the newspaper carefully, smoothed the edges. Then she stood, walked to the bedroom, and opened the old cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were his baby shoes, a photograph of them on a fishing trip, his high school graduation tassel, and a letter he wrote her from basic training signed, "Love you always, Mom. Your boy, Daniel." She closed the lid slowly, sat on the edge of the bed, and whispered the words she had no one to say them to. "I'm coming, Daniel. Even if no one wants me there, I'm coming anyway." Mary Ann didn't sleep that night. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that thickened around her as the hours stretched on. She moved from window to window, checking locks she had already secured, folding and unfolding a dish towel on the kitchen counter, pausing to stare at the framed photo of Daniel in his dress blues that hung in the hallway. It had been taken 4 years ago, the same week he'd completed Bud S. He had mailed it to her himself. No note, just the photo, carefully wrapped in a manila envelope. As if the image alone said what he couldn't. She hadn't spoken to anyone. Since Mrs. Hensley left, her phone had stayed silent. No voicemail, no missed calls. She didn't turn on the television, but television was for people who had time to fill. She had no use for time now, not in the way others did. Not when it was pulling her son further away with every passing second. By morning, she had made her decision. She wasn't going to call the church. She wasn't going to reach out to Daniel's widow or his commanding officer. She wasn't going to ask permission to grieve. She packed a single bag. A change of clothes, a bottle of water, the black skirt suit she had worn to her father's funeral 7 years prior. She placed Daniel's photograph inside the front pocket and zipped it closed. Then she made herself a cup of coffee and drank it in silence, watching the sun rise over the pale rooftops of her neighborhood. When she stepped outside, the morning air hit her with sharp clarity. It was a long drive to the church, 2 states over. It's 12 hours if she didn't stop. She didn't plan to. She filled the tank the night before. She had a printed map in the glove box, though she knew the way by memory. Daniel had once been stationed near there. She had visited him twice. Those weekends had been short and quiet, filled with polite conversations and unspoken tension between her and his wife. The funeral announcement hadn't mentioned her name, but she still remembered the address. She drove with both hands on the wheel, knuckles pale, eyes steady. There was no music, no distractions. Only the hum of the tires against the highway and the sound of her son's voice in her memory. Not any one conversation, just his tone. That particular warmth, that softened. His otherwise quiet demeanor. He hadn't been a talker, not like her. He had always said more in what he didn't say now. The silence between them felt unbearable. She pulled over once, just before the state line, to wash her face and buy a black headscarf from a roadside gas station. The cashier didn't ask questions. She didn't offer answers. She wore the scarf low on her forehead, tied tightly behind her ears. She didn't want to be recognized. She didn't want to be mistaken for someone she wasn't, but she also wasn't going to pretend she was invisible by dusk. She arrived at a small motel 15 minutes from the church. She paid in cash. The front desk clerk gave her a room key without looking up. Room 204, second floor. End of the walkway. Inside, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her phone again. Still nothing. No message, no alert. No apology, just the same cold screen. As if she didn't exist. She opened her bag, laid out the black suit, and smoothed the fabric with slow hands. She didn't cry. The tears hadn't come. Not yet. There was something harder than sadness sitting in her chest. Something colder. Grief had no place to go. It had no pew to sit in. No aisle to walk down. No name on a guest list. Only silence. And a mother who would not stay away. The motel curtains didn't block out the sunrise. But Mary Ann had been awake before the light even touched the window. She sat in the armchair, fully dressed in the black skirt suit, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her shoes, low black heels, worn but polished, rested side by side beneath her. She had tied her scarf again, neat and deliberate, just as she used to before hospital shifts, when she wanted no nonsense from the world. The funeral was at 10. She left the motel at 9:30. There was no traffic, just the quiet hum of small town. Saturday mornings, a jogger passing the sidewalk. Okay? A boy on a bicycle too big for him. The flicker of sprinklers coming on in orderly rows. When she turned the corner onto St. Mark's Road, her grip tightened on the wheel. The church stood at the top of the hill, brick and stained glass, its narrow steeple casting a long shadow over the lot. The parking spaces were already filling. Up, she pulled into a side space far from the front steps, not out of fear but because she didn't want to be seen too early. She needed a moment, one final breath before whatever waited ahead. From the car she could see the gathering crowd, some in suits, others in full dress uniform. A flag-draped casket had already been carried inside. She wasn't early, but she wasn't late either. She opened her door, stepped out slowly, and walked toward the church. It was a short walk, but with each step the weight grew. Not just the grief, but the uncertainty. The question she hadn't wanted to ask. Would they even let her in? At the base of the church steps, two men stood in black suits. One was clearly a church deacon, the other an usher holding a printed list. It's the kind of list she had not been invited to join. "Ma'am," the usher said gently, blocking her path. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for Lieutenant Daniel Cooper's funeral," Marianne replied, her voice steady. He looked at her, then at the list. "Your name?" She hesitated. "Marianne. Cooper? I'm his mother." The man blinked. The silence after her words wasn't long, but it was enough. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes shifting away. "We were told to keep the guest list limited to immediate family and invited personnel. The widow gave us a list. I am immediate family," she said. The calm in her voice now held steel. "I raised him." The church deacon stepped forward, voice quiet but firm. "We were instructed not to allow ... extended guests. The service is private." She looked past them toward the open doors. She could see the edge of the casket inside. The American flag. A folded white program in someone's hands. She could see her son surrounded by strangers. "I understand," she said, but she didn't move. Behind her, more guests were arriving, most of them pausing as they saw the scene at the steps. Some looked away quickly. Others whispered. Few recognized her, maybe from photos, maybe from Daniel's past, but no one stepped forward. No one spoke on her behalf. The usher, flustered now, cleared his throat. "There's a viewing area in the church hall. You can sit in there. Down the side steps, there's a live feed of the ceremony." Marianne said nothing. Her hands were folded in front of her, her posture still. A nurse's posture. A mother's. She turned and walked back down the steps. Past the curious stares. Past the sound of church bells starting to toll, back to her car. Not one person stopped. Her not one voice said her name. They were burying her son and pretending she didn't exist. The engine idled longer than it needed to. Marianne sat in the driver's seat, her hands still resting on the wheel, not turning it, not shifting gears. The scarf she had so carefully tied that morning now felt like a band around her throat. The suit, chosen with reverence, suddenly felt like a costume. Something worn for a part she had never been allowed to play. She watched as the guests filed into the church. One by one, they disappeared through the wide double doors. A young officer paused at the steps, turned to check something in his jacket, then followed. She didn't recognize most of them. Maybe colleagues, maybe friends. People who had shared her son's last months, last hours. People who had stories of him, stories she might never hear. She hadn't even known he was back stateside. She found herself wondering when his body had arrived. How it had been flown. Whether the flag was folded properly. Whether someone had stood beside him during the flight home. She should have been there. That was her place. She had held his body when he was born, washed his skinned knees when he was 6. and sat beside him in the ER when he broke his arm falling from the tree in their backyard. She had fed him when he couldn't sleep from deployment nerves and waited by the phone for a call that sometimes never came. She had given him her whole life. Now she was watching strangers carry him to his final rest. She shifted into reverse and backed slowly out of the parking space. No one looked her way. The world had gone on without her. The funeral was beginning, and she was nowhere in it. The road curved away from the church, the trees lining it still holding the green of early spring. She drove slowly, as if speed would be a betrayal. Each house she passed felt like it belonged in a world she wasn't part of anymore. Children playing in yards, flags fluttering quietly on front porches, the ordinary motion of people who didn't know that just up the hill. A mother was being shut out of her own grief. She didn't cry. There was something beyond tears in her now. Something still and deep, like a lake frozen solid under winter sky. It wasn't numbness. It was awareness. A hollow awareness that this moment, this erasure, would be something she'd carry for the rest of her life. She drove without a destination, past the town limits, past the gas station, onto a narrow road where fences leaned with age and telephone wires sagged under their own weight. Her mind wandered to Daniel's childhood again, how they used to drive out to the edge of town just to escape the noise. He'd roll the window down, stick his hand out like a fin in the wind. Used to ask questions then, big ones. The kind a boy asks his mother when the world still makes some kind of sense. Do you think heroes know their heroes? He once asked her. He was 8. She had answered. I think real heroes don't spend time thinking about it. She wondered if he'd remembered that. And then her phone buzzed. Just once. A message. She pulled over. Her hands were steady but slow. She didn't recognize the number. No contact saved. Just a single message. Are you Daniel's mother? No signature. No context, but her heart reacted before her mind did. She typed back, yes. A pause. Then another message. Please meet us. Not at the church. Around the corner. The VFW hall back entrance. She stared at the screen. Her fingers hovered, uncertain. Who is us? Why now? Why not before? But something told her to go. Not for answers. Not for confrontation, because if anyone had seen her, truly seen her, it was whoever sent that message. She started the car again and turned. Back toward town. Not toward the church, but toward the only door that might still open. The VFW hall sat 2 blocks behind the church, tucked between a shuttered post office and a gravel lot where the grass grew in uneven clumps. It was a squat, plain building, bricks faded by weather, a flagpole out front, motionless. Marianne had passed it earlier in the day without thinking. Now it was the only place left that asked nothing of her. She parked in the back where a single, rusted bench leaned under a mesquite tree. Well, there were no other cars nearby. No sign of anyone waiting. The gravel crunched beneath her heels as she stepped out and walked slowly to the rear entrance. The door opened before she could knock. 2 men stood inside, both in dress blues. One was older, late 40s, maybe 50, with a lined face and a sharp jaw. The other was younger, early 30s, broad-shouldered with a scar near his left eyebrow. They didn't ask who she was. They didn't speak right away. They just stepped back, giving her space to enter. Inside, the air was cool. Dim fluorescent lights buzzed above folding tables set up for some forgotten event. The room smelled faintly of floor polish and paper cups. It was empty, except for a table near the far wall where a third man sat, head bowed, fingers pressed against his brow like he was praying or remembering. When he looked up, Marianne stopped. She didn't recognize him. But something in his eyes, quiet, worn, unwavering, felt familiar. Thank you for coming, he said. She nodded, unsure what words would fit. I'm Petty Officer Reuben Holt, he continued. I served with Daniel. We all did. He gestured to the 2 others. We were his team. Marianne didn't sit. She held her bag in front of her, knuckles white against the handle. I wasn't allowed inside, she said, not accusing, just stating a fact like a nurse reading off symptoms. We know, Holt replied. That's why we asked you here. Marianne studied them. They looked tired, not just from grief, but from the effort of carrying something unspoken. Soldiers had a way of aging through silence. She had seen it in Daniel too. The church turned me away, she said again, softer this time. They didn't even say his mother's name. The older SEAL, who hadn't spoken yet, finally did. That wasn't his call. We want you to know that. Daniel didn't plan it this way. I wasn't notified, she said. Not by the Navy, not by anyone. Holt reached into his jacket and pulled out 3 sealed envelopes. He laid them carefully on the table, spaced evenly. Marianne stared at them. Each was labeled in her son's handwriting. To Mom, open if I don't come home. The weight in her chest shifted. Not gone, it's just moved. She took a step forward but didn't touch them yet. We found these in his footlocker, Holt said. The other stuff went to the wife. But these were for you. He kept them separate, said if anything happened, we'd know what to do. The youngest SEAL added, he talked about you all the time. Holidays, childhood stories. He still wore that little cross necklace you gave him when he was 10. Marianne swallowed hard. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He told you about me? All the time, Holt said. She looked down at the envelopes. The weight of them, the fact that her son had written these words knowing she might never get them. Why didn't anyone tell me? She asked. They didn't rush to answer. Eventually, Holt replied, sometimes families get messy. Command follows whatever information is given. They didn't question the next of kin forms. We didn't either, not until it was too late. His wife made it clear, the older SEAL said. She didn't want you there, she said, ... You'd bring drama. Marianne let that settle. It didn't surprise her. But it still burned. She can rewrite the obituary, she said. She can control the guest list, but she can't change the blood in his veins. The 3 men stood silent. Marianne stepped closer, picked up the envelopes, and pressed them to her chest. She still hadn't cried. Not really. Not in the full way grief demands. You were the only ones who knew, she said quietly. And we're not letting them erase you, Holt replied. He was your son. And that church, those people, they'll know it before the day is over. Marianne looked at him, uncertain what he meant. The church doors may have stayed shut, he said, but we're not done. The sanctuary at St. Mark's was filled with polished wood, sun-bleached banners, and a low, respectful hush that accompanied military funerals. Rows of pressed uniforms lined the pews, medals catching light as if reflecting unspoken grief. At the front of the room, the flag-draped casket rested beneath a floral arch, silent and heavy, a national symbol covering the loss of a single life. Near the pulpit, seated where the eye naturally landed first, was the widow, Eliza Cooper. She wore a simple black dress and clutched a folded handkerchief in one hand, though her eyes remained dry. Her posture was careful, poised without strain, practiced without comfort. Next to her sat Daniel's father, long divorced. From Marianne, his expression unreadable, eyes downcast. Behind them sat Eliza's family. Brothers, a sister-in-law, her mother, her stepfather. They filled the front 2 pews entirely, as if by occupancy alone they had claimed the space. No one beside them had known Daniel. Longer than a handful of years, no one there had changed his diapers, or driven him to soccer practice, or waited outside his bedroom while he cried from deployment. And yet the church had accepted their authority without hesitation. Eliza had been the one to fill out the funeral paperwork, the next of kin form, the instructions for who would receive the flag, who would be allowed to speak, who would be listed in the program. The Navy had simply followed procedure. A widow's word was law. The obituary had been short, clean, formal. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper is survived by his wife, Eliza Cooper. He is remembered for his bravery, his service, and his devotion to duty. A private funeral will be held at St. Mark's Episcopal Church. No mention of his mother, no mention of the woman who had raised him. For nearly 20 years before Eliza had ever entered his life. At the time, no one had questioned the omission. Not the church, not the funeral director, not even the Navy liaison officer assigned to the service. They had treated it as routine, and Eliza had made it clear behind closed doors that she wanted no disruption, that she did not want Daniel's past interfering with the ceremony, that his mother's presence would complicate things. The deacon had complied. So had the ushers. When Elisa arrived that morning, they had followed her lead without question. They had kept Marianne off the premises because they had been told to, because she wasn't on the list. The room itself reflected this edited version of Daniel's life. A large photograph displayed at the front showed him in uniform, standing proudly beside Eliza. Another framed photo at the guest book showed Daniel with Eliza's nephew on his shoulders. The video slideshow playing before the service began included pictures from their wedding, a vacation, a promotion ceremony, each image carefully selected. None showed his childhood, none showed Marianne. No one in the church knew that 2 blocks away, Daniel's mother had just held the letters he wrote her in case he died. That 3 seals, men who had bled beside her son, pulled her into the fold she'd been cut from. Inside the church, the organ began its slow processional. The clergy moved to their places. The minister opened the program and welcomed the mourners. No one noticed that 3 men in full dress blues at the back pews didn't rise when asked. No one noticed them at all, but they were waiting, because the widow's word had closed the church's doors, and now, without warning, something else was about to open. The wind had picked up slightly by mid-morning, carrying with it the scent of fresh-cut grass and church lilies. Marianne sat alone in her car, parked far enough down the hill to be out of view, but close enough to hear the faint echo of organ music through the walls of St. Mark's. She could see the line of cars that had overflowed the main lot. See that slow movement of mourners exiting their vehicles and walking in pairs toward the front entrance. No one looked in her direction. She hadn't turned on the engine again since pulling into this spot. The car's interior had grown warm under the sun, but she didn't roll down the windows. She didn't move at all. She simply sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, the 3 letters resting beside her on the passenger seat. She had not opened them yet, not because she didn't want to, but because the weight of what they might say, his final thoughts, his words meant only for her, was something she needed to face in the right moment. And this, whatever this moment was, still didn't feel real. Her eyes drifted back to the church. She remembered sitting in a pew once with Daniel when he was 7. His feet swinging above the floor, tapping her leg with nervous energy. He had asked if God could hear him if he whispered. She had told him yes. And he had whispered something into his sleeve, then smiled at her like it had worked. That memory had stayed with her. How quiet faith had once been something Daniel believed, in something small, simple, private. Now she wasn't allowed to say goodbye. She imagined the eulogy being read at that very moment. Perhaps it spoke of courage, of service, of Daniel's discipline and his commitment to his country. Maybe there was a reading from Psalms. Maybe someone was reciting the flag-folding ritual, some meaning behind each crease. But Marianne wasn't part of any of it. There had been no seat reserved for her, no mention of her name from the pulpit, no soft touch on the shoulder or knowing glance from a neighbor. She was invisible, omitted, not because she had done something wrong, but because someone else had chosen to remove her. Her presence was not welcome. She stared down at her hands, then at the scarf still tied across her head, and for a brief second wondered what she must look like to the people walking past the latif. They saw her at all, just an older woman in a parked car, just a stranger. A voice in her head whispered what she didn't want to hear. They think he didn't love you enough to include you. The thought pierced deeper than any insult, because she knew the truth, and yet she had nothing to prove it but silence. And then she noticed movement in her rearview mirror. 2 figures, dressed in uniform, walking slowly across the lot behind her. She sat up straighter, watched as they approached. Her chest tightened. Were they here to deliver something? Were they going to ask her to leave? But the men didn't knock. They didn't speak. They simply paused beside her car, standing in the sun like sentinels. One of them, she recognized him from earlier. The man who had handed her the letters nodded toward her window. She lowered it halfway. He spoke quietly. "You don't have to stay out here." His words were simple, without force. But they held. Wait, Marianne didn't answer right away? She looked up toward the church once more, toward the doors that had been closed to her. Then she looked back at the men standing beside her. They weren't asking for permission. They were standing in place of the apology she had never received. And she understood. She didn't need to force her way into the church because something else was beginning now, and it would not happen inside those walls, inside the church. The service pressed forward with solemn rhythm. The minister read from Ecclesiastes. A family friend stepped up to the podium and spoke in general terms about service, about duty, about sacrifice. He had known Daniel for 5 years. He spoke well, respectfully, but the words were practiced, neat, filtered through the lens of recent history. There was no mention of Daniel's childhood, no mention of who he was before the uniform. The guests listened politely, heads bowed, tissues dabbed at eyes. It was, on the surface, the kind of funeral that looked like honor, but something quiet was building in the back pews. 3 men sat side by side in full navy dress. They had not joined the procession. They had not greeted the family. They had arrived, late, without announcement, and taken their seats in the last row, silent still, and watching. Their names were not in the program. No one in the front rows had invited them, but they had come anyway, to most in attendance. They blended into the uniformed crowd. But to those who looked closely, there was something different about them. Their posture was tighter, not ceremonial, functional. Their eyes did not wander. They did not nod along to the eulogy. They listened, but not with agreement. They watched, but not with approval. They were there for someone who wasn't in the church. They were there for Marianne, the youngest of the 3. Petty Officer Luis Moreno held something small in his hand, a silver crucifix on a frayed chain. It had belonged to Daniel. He had worn it under his uniform every day of deployment. It's the same cross his mother had given him when he was 10. Moreno had found it among Daniel's personal effects and pocketed it quietly, knowing it was not for official hands. The oldest of the group, Chief Petty Officer Frank Ingram, had served in 4 combat zones. He didn't cry at funerals. He hadn't cried in 30 years. But his jaw was tight, and his eyes hadn't left the casket since they sat down. He had carried Daniel's body through the dust of Kandahar. He had closed the bag himself. He had helped write the first field report of death. And he had insisted on attending this funeral. Even after learning the mother had been left out, beside them sat Reuben Holt, who had messaged Marianne that morning. He didn't carry anything. He didn't shift in his seat. Sat still, spine straight, hands folded on his lap. The movement he was planning hadn't begun yet. It would start soon, during the final prayer. When heads bowed and the church fell into reverent quiet, Holt turned slightly and nodded to the others. It was almost imperceptible. A gesture practiced between men who had once moved under fire together. No one else in the pews noticed. Outside, Marianne stood just beyond the church entrance, out of view of the guests, her back straight, her scarf now removed. The letters rested inside her purse. Her face was calm, not expressionless, but resolved. And when the organ began the final hymn, the seals rose. It was not a synchronized movement. It was not loud, but it was deliberate. 3 uniforms stood in the back of the sanctuary, side by side. Not to leave, not to disrupt, but to reclaim something. To challenge what had been silenced. They walked slowly, not toward the altar, but toward the center aisle. toward the rows of mourners who had never questioned why a mother wasn't seated. Among them, heads began to turn. Whispers began to ripple. Someone near the front stood up, confused, as the seals moved closer, and then they stopped mid-dial, backs straight. Eyes forward, they didn't speak. They didn't need to, because in that stillness, in the quiet interruption of ritual, every person in the church began to realize someone was missing, and the absence could no longer be ignored the moment the hymn ended. The room fell into stillness. No rustling, no movement. The usual flow of ceremonial routine had been interrupted gently, yet unmistakably, by the three uniformed men who now stood facing the altar. Their presence in the center aisle wasn't aggressive, wasn't loud, but it changed the room. The back row no longer belonged to silence. At the front of the sanctuary, the minister hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the widow, unsure whether to proceed. Eliza sat still, her face composed, though her fingers clutched the edge of her chair just slightly tighter than before. She had noticed the men. She didn't know who they were. But she knew what they were doing. The folded flag was already in. The hands of the Navy Honor Guard ready to be passed forward. The final act of formal mourning, the moment where military meets family in a gesture of sacrifice and thanks. The senior officer in charge stepped toward the casket, took the flag with practiced hands, and turned to approach the front row. He had done this many times before. He did not pause. He knelt before Eliza. On behalf of the President of the United States Navy, and a grateful nation. He recited the words as they had been written generations ago. Words spoken in war zones and cathedrals, beside muddy graves and polished stone markers. He held the folded flag out to her. Eliza took it without hesitation. Her hands were steady. Her eyes stayed forward. The room exhaled almost as one. The formality was complete. The ceremony on paper was flawless. But in the center aisle, the three seals did not sit. They remained standing, unmoved, because something had gone wrong. Something quiet but irreversible. The flag had been given to the wrong person, not legally, not according to paperwork, but morally, viscerally. Historically, it should have gone to the mother, to the woman who had held Daniel when he couldn't sleep, who had sat in hospital waiting rooms while he got stitched up from boyhood accidents, who had packed his first deployment bag with trembling hands and prayers in every fold, to the woman who had not been invited, who now stood outside Moreno. Looked toward the side of the church where a narrow row of stained glass windows ran above the pews. Through the colored glass, he could just make out the faint silhouette of a figure outside, motionless, watching. He didn't need to ask who it was. Chief Ingram took a step forward. No one stopped him. He turned not toward the casket, but toward the pews, and spoke not loudly, but clearly. "There's someone missing." Every head turned. The room stilled again. He didn't say Marianne's name. He didn't have to. Reuben Holt stepped beside him, his voice just above a whisper. But carrying in the sudden quiet, she raised him, alone. She loved him before the uniform, before the medals, before all of this. The minister opened his mouth to intervene, but no words came. From the corner of the sanctuary, Eliza stood. The folded flag remained in her hands, but something shifted in her expression. A flicker of discomfort, then stubbornness, and calculation. "I'm his wife," she said evenly, loud enough for the back row to hear. "No one disputes that," Ingram replied. "But you didn't raise him. You didn't bring him into this world." A silence followed, heavier than any prayer. No one moved until, from the rear of the sanctuary, a new presence entered. Marianne. She had stepped quietly through the side door. Her scarf was gone, her bag held to her side. Her shoes clicked softly against the tile floor as she walked slow, unhurried, with the stillness of someone who had carried too much sorrow for too long to be afraid anymore. Every eye turned. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply stood at the back of the church, facing the flag that had been handed away without her. And in that moment, the ceremony shattered quietly. respectfully but completely, because now the real goodbye could begin. Marianne didn't expect anyone to move when she entered. She didn't expect apologies or acknowledgement or even space to stand. She stepped through the door without ceremony, without escort. The silence that greeted her wasn't one of welcome, it was the stunned silence of people realizing they had overlooked something sacred. She paused near the threshold, just past the last pew. The wooden floor beneath her shoes creaked softly, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes swept the room not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. This was not her church. These were not her people. Yet somewhere in this room, beneath all the flowers and uniforms and folded papers, her son was present. And that was the only thing that mattered. At the far end of the aisle, she saw him. Not his body, not the casket, but a face. The man who had texted her that morning now stood near the aisle, uniformed and unmoving. He turned just slightly as she stepped in, and in that instant, something shifted. Not dramatic, not loud. It's just a flicker of human recognition, like seeing someone you hadn't known you were waiting for. Reuben Holt. She didn't know his name yet, but she remembered the eyes. The way he had looked at her outside the VFW hall, not with pity, not with discomfort, but with steady, earned understanding. Their eyes met now across the sanctuary. He gave the slightest nod, and then from the pew nearest the door, someone stood. A man in civilian clothes, late middle age. Marianne couldn't place him at first, but he stepped out into the aisle and turned toward her. Daniel's father. He hadn't spoken to her in years. Divorce had drawn a permanent line between their worlds. They had grieved separately through every stage of Daniel's adulthood, milestones divided by silence. But now he looked at her with the weary, shattered look of a man who had lost the five. I should have lost the only person tying him to something good. He didn't say her name. He didn't reach out. But he stepped aside and made space in the aisle. A quiet, deliberate gesture. It was the first acknowledgement she'd received from anyone inside the church. She began to walk past guests who couldn't meet her eyes, past folded programs clutched in silent hands, past a row of men in uniform who had spent their lives trained to react, yet now sat frozen not in fear, but in shame. And at the front of the aisle, holding the folded flag with whitened knuckles, was Eliza. The widow did not move. She held the flag close to her chest, as if it were armor. But Marianne wasn't walking toward her. She was walking toward the casket. There it lay, draped in stars and stripes, flanked by floral arrangements and the weight of 100 unspoken memories. She paused in front of it, just a few feet away, and took a quiet breath. She didn't touch the wood. She didn't kneel. She simply stood. For a long moment, no one moved. And then Reuben Holt stepped forward from the back row. He approached quietly, not rushing, not drawing attention. In his hand, he carried something small, familiar. A photograph. Marianne turned slightly as he neared. He held the photo out to her. It was aged, edges curled slightly from time. It's a picture of Daniel, maybe 17, sitting on the hood of her old Toyota in their front yard. Smiling, shirt half tucked, braces barely visible. The kind of photo mothers keep in wallets, on dressers, in drawers they open on birthdays when no one's watching. She had taken that picture herself. She accepted it without speaking. Her fingers brushed the worn edge. I found it in his locker, Holt said softly. He carried it with him. Marianne didn't respond. Her throat was too tight, her hands too still, but her eyes, wet now, never left the image. The version of her son before war, before grief, before he became someone shared with the world behind them. The congregation remained silent. The man in charge of the service stepped forward as if to say something, then hesitated because something had changed. This was no longer just a ceremony. This was a reckoning, and a mother had finally returned to claim her place. The question came not from Eliza, nor the minister, nor anyone seated in a pew. It came from one of the SEALs standing near the aisle, Petty Officer Luis Moreno, the youngest of the three. His voice was soft but carried easily through the stillness, like the end of a prayer. "Are you his mother?" The words didn't sting. They didn't accuse. They were a request for truth, not proof, not paperwork. Just the spoken acknowledgement of something that everyone in the room had been dancing around but hadn't said out loud. Mary Ann turned to him slowly. "I am." She answered. She said it plainly, without emotion, without effort, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. And in that moment, it was. The confirmation seemed to ripple through the sanctuary. Some people shifted in their seats, some glanced down, others stared forward, unable to reconcile the quiet woman standing at the casket with the version of the ceremony they'd accepted until now. Eliza stiffened in the front row. She looked down at the folded flag still resting in her lap and clutched it tighter. The recognition in the room wasn't directed at her anymore. For the first time that day, Mary Ann's voice broke slightly, but only slightly. "I carried him," she said, turning back to the casket, "for 9 months before anyone else knew his name." She didn't look at the crowd. She wasn't addressing them. She wasn't giving a speech. She was speaking to the wooden box that held everything she'd lost, to the silence inside it, to the boy she remembered before uniforms and rank and funerals. "I watched him sleep with one hand curled under his chin," she continued. "I taught him how to tie his shoes. I held his hand when he had his tonsils out." Her voice stayed steady, even as the weight of memory pressed down on her. "When he deployed, I didn't sleep for 3 days. I kept the phone under my pillow, just in case." She looked back at the seals then. "You asked me if I was his mother. I was. I still am. And I didn't need a seat on a list to know that." Reuben Holt stepped closer. Not in intrusion, just to stand beside her, kind of unspoken shield. "He wrote about you," Holt said quietly, addressing the room now. "All the time." Mary Ann looked at him with surprised gratitude. In Kandahar, after the first raid, Holt continued. "Hey, read a letter you sent him." Out loud, "We were exhausted 2 days without sleep." He read your words like they were the only thing keeping him grounded. The room remained silent, and on his last night, Holt added, he talked about home, about the smell of your kitchen, about how he missed your voice. Mary Ann blinked quickly, but the tears didn't fall. They rose, held just beneath the surface. "You were never gone from him," Holt finished. "Not even for a moment." A long pause followed, and then, in a voice that cracked just once, Mary Ann whispered, "Thank you." The words weren't meant for the crowd. They were meant for the man who had remembered her son without needing a formal place to do it. Behind them, a rustle of movement came from the first pew. Elisa stood, the flag still clutched in her arms. She didn't walk forward. She didn't speak. But her eyes locked onto Mary Ann's with a mix of unease, defensiveness, and something else. Something beginning to crumble. The certainty that had propped up her control was faltering. She had rewritten the guest list. She had excluded Mary Ann from the obituary. She had sealed the church doors to the past. But she couldn't stop a question as simple and as seismic as, "Are you his mother?" And she couldn't stop the room from recognizing the answer. Because everyone had heard it. Everyone had seen it. And no one could unsee it now. The air inside the church had grown still, not reverent, but uncertain. The script had been broken. The ceremony, so tightly controlled until now, felt hollow. Guests shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort, but realization. Something important had happened, and no one had stopped it. No one had dared Mary Ann. Remained near the casket, her back to the pews. The photograph Reuben had given her was still in her hand, the edges slightly curled from the pressure of her grip. She had spoken not to the congregation, but to her son. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone present that this service, this polished ritual, had left out something essential. Holt leaned closer, just enough for her to hear. "There's more you should know," he said quietly, But not here. Marianne turned to him, brow furrowed. Outside, he added, after the service, just us. She nodded once. They stayed until the last hymn began. The minister resumed the program, voice steady but thinner now, like someone trying to stitch a torn curtain without thread. The choir, small and practiced, sang softly behind him. Some of the mourners joined in. Most did not dot at the final benediction. The congregation rose. The casket would not be taken to the cemetery until later. For now, it remained at the altar, draped and surrounded by arrangements carefully selected for visual symmetry. But void of personal meaning, Marianne took a step back. Eliza stood in the front pew, flag still in her hands, but her confidence had cracked. She didn't approach Marianne, didn't speak. Her silence now felt less like authority and more like retreat. Marianne left the sanctuary the same way she entered, alone. But this time, she wasn't invisible. Heads turned as she passed. Some nodded, others looked away. A few murmured her name under their breath, as if only just realizing who she was. The sun outside had risen higher, casting long shadows across the walkway. It was warmer now, dry wind moving through the hedges, lifting dust from the stone steps. Marianne walked back down the path without hurry. She didn't return to her car. Instead, she stopped beside the oak tree just beyond the parking lot near a row of stone benches, the quiet space between the church and the rest of the world. She sat a few minutes later. The three seals appeared: Holt, Ingram, and Moreno. Longer in formation. No longer part of the ceremonial structure they had briefly disrupted. They walked with the ease of men who had made peace with disobedience. Not for rebellion's sake, but for something higher. They joined her without a word. Holt sat first beside her. The other two stood nearby, giving space. Like guards who no longer needed to guard anything. There's something we didn't tell you inside. Holt began. Marianne turned to him slowly. Before he left for his last mission, Holt said, Daniel gave us 3 things. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed slightly with time. A letter. Not like the others. This one was for the church, in case something happened. Marianne's breath caught. He asked us to deliver it directly. Holt continued. Said he wasn't sure how things would go if it ever came to this. He handed her the paper. The outside read, To whom it may concern, regarding my funeral wishes from Lt. Daniel Cooper, SEAL Team 6. Marianne held it, but didn't open it. Her fingers trembled now, slightly. She could feel the weight of his voice even before reading the words. He wanted you there, Holt said. I asked for you by name. Asked that you be seated with family. Said that no matter what anyone else said, you were to be included. Marianne's eyes stayed on the paper. So why wasn't this delivered, she asked. We gave it to the church, Ingram said. The day after he died, handed it to the administrative assistant. She said it would be passed along to the pastor and the family. And it wasn't, Marianne whispered. No, Holt confirmed. It was buried in paperwork, or buried on purpose. There was no way to know now. But the outcome was the same. Daniel had asked for his mother, and the church had ignored him. Marianne looked down at the sealed letter. It had arrived too late to change the service. But not too late to change what came next. We're going to make it right, Holt said quietly. Not in there, out here. And for the first time since she'd read the funeral notice in the newspaper, Marianne allowed herself to feel something that wasn't grief. It was something quieter, firmer. Beginning back at the motel, Marianne laid the 3 unopened letters across the small round table near the window. The morning's light had already shifted toward afternoon, leaving a golden stripe of sun on the carpet. She hadn't turned on the television. The room was still and silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner. Each envelope bore the same handwriting. To Mom, open if I don't come home. No dates, no stamps. Just the shape of her name written in her son's hand, familiar and steady. She had held them through the entire service, through the confrontation at the church, through The walk back to her car and the quiet drive to this room. They had rested against her chest like a second heartbeat. Now they sat in a row, fragile and unopened. She stared at them for a long time before picking up the first one. Her fingers were careful, as if the paper might dissolve with too much pressure. She broke the seal and unfolded the page slowly. "Mom, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. I'm sorry. Wanted to come back to you. I really did. I promised myself that I would. I'm sorry I broke that dot. I need you to know something. I never stopped being your boy, Kate, even when I stopped calling as much. Even when I got quiet. You never stopped being home for me. You remember that night before I left for my first deployment? When you packed my bag 3 times just to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything? I acted annoyed, but it helped. You helped, always. They call what we do over here service, but I always felt like you were the one serving. You gave up everything for me, and I saw it. Remember, please don't let them leave you out. You belong at my funeral. You belong. In every story they tell. They try to erase, you don't let them. You're the reason I became the man they're honoring. I love you. Mom, I always have. Your boy." Daniel asterisk. She didn't cry. Not at first. She held the letter close to her chest and breathed in shallow, controlled rhythms. Nurses learned not to break, to isolate. Years of caregiving had trained her to hold emotions in the muscles behind the eyes. But the words weren't just sentences. They were Daniel's voice, unfiltered, unedited, and untouched by politics or protocol. He had written it knowing she might be left behind. He had written it knowing that grief might not come with a seat. At the front row, she set the letter down and reached for the second envelope. "Hey, Mom, this one's shorter. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for staying up with me the night before boot camp, for pretending you weren't scared when I left, for sending letters even when I didn't answer. Sometimes I didn't write back because I didn't know how to say everything. But your letters meant everything. I read them during the worst nights. I kept them under my gear. I still have that cross you gave me, the one from your bedside table. I wore it during every op. It made me feel like you were there. Like I couldn't go completely wrong as long as I had it. They don't really give medals to moms, but if they did, you'd have all of them. I love you, Daniel asterisk." This time, the tears came. Quiet, slow, unannounced. They welled behind her eyes and slipped down her cheeks in steady lines. She didn't sob. She didn't shake. She just wept like someone who had finally been spoken to. After years of being dismissed, he hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't sided with silence. She reached for the last envelope. Asterisk. "Mom, I want you to forgive me, not for anything I did, but for the things I didn't do, for not telling you enough, for not pushing harder when you were pushed out. I let things get complicated. I thought there would be more time to fix it. But if you're reading this, then I didn't get that chance. I need you to be strong, not just for me, but for you. You deserve more than silence. You deserve the truth to be said out loud. I want people to know who you are. I want them to know what you gave. Don't let grief make you small. You're the only voice I still have." Daniel asterisk. Marianne sat for a long time after the final letter, her hands resting in her lap. The pages spread gently across the table like photographs laid out for remembrance. She had feared being forgotten, but she had never been. He had written her into his ending with the same clarity she had raised him in from the beginning. And now, with his words in her hands, she understood. This wasn't just closure. It was permission to speak, to be seen. The next morning, Marianne returned to the VFW hall. She hadn't planned to. She had driven past it twice, circling the block like someone stalling before a difficult conversation. But something had settled in her overnight. Something rooted not in anger, not even in grief, but in the quiet strength that comes when you realize someone else had carried your name like a banner through foreign soil. She parked in the same gravel spot behind the building. The morning light was clear and unforgiving, stretching across the lot in pale stripes. Her hands didn't tremble when she reached for the door handle. Inside, the hall looked unchanged. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The smell of coffee lingered from an earlier brew. A few veterans sat at a folding table near the wall, playing cards, their laughter quiet and aged. No one turned when she entered. She walked to the far end, where the same three men, Holt, Ingram, and Moreno, were seated again. They had arrived earlier than she had. Holt stood the moment he saw her. "Ma'am," he said, and this time it wasn't formal, it was familiar. "I read the letters," she said simply. Holt nodded, offering her the seat across from him. "They changed everything," she added. He hesitated, then said, "They changed a lot for us, too." She sat down, folding her hands together on the table. The way she used to at parent-teacher conferences, or when Daniel was being fitted for his first uniform. Ingram poured her a cup of coffee. She hadn't asked for one. It was just something done instinctively, like they'd seen her do it 1,000 times before. "He talked about you all the time," Moreno said, breaking the quiet. She turned to him. Even when no one asked, he continued. "You were part of his stories, childhood stuff, things you made for dinner, jokes you used to tell." Marianne's eyes searched his face, not for doubt, but for truth. He wasn't embellishing. He wasn't offering comfort. He was reporting, like a man giving a field update from the front lines of memory. "He said you used to cut his sandwiches in triangles," Moreno said with a half smile, "but only when he had a good day." Squares were for average days. Marianne smiled barely. "That's true," she said softly. "He used to keep score." Holt leaned in slightly. "He didn't just talk about you when things were easy. It was in the hard moments, too, after missions. On long nights, when we were somewhere no one could pronounce and didn't know if we'd make it to sunrise." She listened. He'd say, "My mom would hate this coffee." Or she'd be yelling at me to change my socks right now. It was like you were there, not just a memory present. Marianne looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the seam in the plastic surface. "He called me less and less," she admitted. "After he got married, I thought maybe I'd been replaced." "You weren't," Ingram said, his voice firm. "He was proud of you. He told us about your nursing shifts, how you used to take double hours to keep food on the table when he was a kid. He talked about how you never asked for anything, even when you had nothing left." The room grew quiet again. "I've spent the last 3 years thinking he forgot me," Marianne said, her voice low. "He didn't," Holt said. "Not even for a minute." She looked at them, all these men who had shared a version of her son she hadn't seen. The grown man. The soldier. The one she had prepared but couldn't protect. "He left me out of the funeral," she said. "But not out of his heart." "No," Holt said. "He didn't leave you out of anything. Other people did, but not him." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Moreno reached into a folder beside him and pulled out a photocopy. A page from a notebook. Daniel's handwriting. A list of people to notify in case of death. At the top, "Mom, Marianne Cooper, call her first. Tell her I love her." Below were other names. Fellow SEALs, friends, his Eliza's name was there but second. "We found this later," Holt said. "It was in his personal bag, not the official file. He kept it close, closer than his ID." Marianne took the page, her hand still this time. "He never forgot me," she whispered. "No, ma'am," Ingram said. "He carried you with him every day." And for the first time since the funeral, Marianne felt something return. Not closure, but inclusion. She had always been part of the story, and now Luthers finally knew it 2 years before his final deployment. Daniel had sat in a makeshift barracks in Bahrain, a steel cot beneath him and a cracked ceiling fan spinning overhead. It was late one of those endless desert nights when the heat never quite lifted and silence settled like dust. His boots were unlaced. His gear was stowed. And around him, 3 other men played cards without speaking. That was when he made the promise. "Hey, Danielle had said quietly, pulling the photograph of his mother from his shirt pocket. Something happens to me, I need you to do something. Holt remembered the moment like it had just passed. He and Marino had stopped shuffling the deck. Ingram had looked up slowly from his bunk. No matter what the official channels say, Daniel continued, no matter what's written down in some base admin file, my mother is the one who raised me. She deserves to be told properly. Not second, not after a folded flag. She's the first call. The men had nodded. It wasn't. An order it didn't need to be. It was a pact made between soldiers. The kind spoken plainly, meant to live beyond paperwork. A pact born in trust. I don't care what happens between now and then, Daniel added. If you're alive and I'm not, you make sure she knows who I was. Not just what they print in the obit. That was the promise, and after Ramadi, after the blast, after the report was typed, the personal effects sealed. The name added to the list of fallen they had remembered. But something had gone wrong. The chain of command had accepted the widow's narrative. The official notification had gone to Elisa. The funeral was arranged within hours. The obituary posted before Holt or the others even had time to send a message. They had tried the VFW letter. The envelope marked funeral wishes. The name Marianne Cooper written in block print on the outside. They'd handed it to the church administrator themselves. And then the silence came. Now, seated in the same VFW hall where that silence had finally broken, Marianne listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react. She listened the way nurses, dutifully, actively, storing every detail. He made it clear, Holt said. This wasn't just about protocol. It was about love, respect, about the things you did when no one else was watching, said. Moreno added quietly, my mom never asked for anything, not even recognition. But she's the reason I got through all of this. Marianne looked down at her hands. There was dirt under one fingernail, probably from the graveyard. She hadn't noticed until now. She brushed it away with the corner of a napkin, then folded the napkin twice. In the early years, she said, he used to sleep with a nightlight. Wouldn't go to bed without it. Said he was scared someone might come in the window. She smiled faintly. So I stayed up every night and sat outside his door, just in case. The room was quiet. He never knew, she added. I never told him I was there. I just did it. You kept watch? Ingram said. I did, she replied, till he didn't need it anymore. Holt leaned forward, and then he did the same. For us. Marianne met his gaze. There was no triumph in her face, no satisfaction at being vindicated. Just a slow, deep understanding of something she had already known in her bones. You kept your promise, he said. Holt nodded, double quotes. Not soon enough, he said. Marianne looked toward the door of the VFW hall. Sunlight filtered in through the frosted glass. Outside, traffic moved quietly down the road, the world continuing, as it always did. Nothing about grief ever arrives on time, she murmured. But knowing he remembered me, that he made sure you did. That's more than most mothers get. They sat in silence for a while. Then Marianne asked, was he afraid? The men looked at each other, then back at her. No, Holt said. He wasn't afraid. He was ready, Ingram added. Not to die. No one's ever ready for that. But ready to protect something bigger than himself? He said, Moreno added, if anything happens. Don't let them make my mom feel small. Marianne closed her eyes. She remembered the day he left for his first deployment. The hug that lasted too long. The unsaid things pressed in too. That silence, and now. Here it was, said. Heard, kept. The promise made before deployment had found its way home. The funeral crowd was gone by late afternoon. The folding chairs had been cleared, the floral sprays removed. Even the canopy that shaded. The casket earlier in the day had been dismantled and packed away. Only the freshly turned earth remained a dark, clean rectangle in the middle of the cemetery's veteran section, bordered by crisp sod and brass markers gleaming in the sunlight. Marianne waited until the last car left. She had parked a few rows back, away from the official gathering. No one had seen her arrive. That was how she wanted it. The men from the team had offered to come with her, but she had said no. This part was hers alone. She walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but with the deliberate pace of someone measuring each step. The black heels she had worn to the funeral had been traded for quiet flats. She carried nothing in her hands, not flowers, not a flag. Just the small photo Reuben had given her the day before, Daniel 17, smiling against the hood of their old car. She reached the grave and stood at its edge. No headstone yet. Just a simple metal stake bearing his name on a temporary marker, Lt. Daniel Cooper, U.S. Navy SEAL. March 15, 1987, April 2, 2024. She read it once, then again, and looked past it to the open sky. For several minutes she said nothing. She remembered the nights she used to tuck him in, smoothing the sheet across his small chest while he pretended not to be sleepy. The way he whispered questions into the dark about stars, about God, about whether she'd still be there when he woke up. She had always said yes, and now here she was. I couldn't stop them, she said aloud, though no one was near enough to hear. They left me out, but you didn't. The breeze picked up, moving the low branches of the nearby trees in a slow, steady sway. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called. The rest of the cemetery was quiet. She crouched, then carefully, deliberately unrested the photo at the base of the marker, just beneath his name. It wasn't framed, it wasn't sealed, but it belonged there. It's not for visitors, it's for him. You wore this close to your heart, she said, her voice low. Now it's my turn. She sat on the grass beside the grave, crossing her legs carefully. Smoothing her skirt over her knees, she didn't cry, she didn't tremble. She simply sat with her son. It's the way she had when he was small and sick, curled up on the couch, his head in her lap. The way she had after he broke his arm and wouldn't let the doctors near him until she said it was okay. She ran her fingers across the grass where the casket lay beneath. The sun was warm on her back. I read your letters, she whispered, every word. And then, after a long silence, you remembered me. She stayed like that for nearly an hour. At one point, a groundskeeper in a green shirt passed by in a utility cart, slowed briefly when he saw her, then tipped his hat and drove on. No one else approached. By the time she rose to leave, the light had shifted again. Long shadows stretched across the gravestones. Her knees ached as she stood. She brushed dirt from her skirt, straightened her back. Before she turned away, she touched the marker one last time, fingertips resting briefly on his name. I'll come back soon, she said softly. Then she walked back to her car without looking behind. But she didn't drive away immediately, because just as she reached for her keys, she saw something in her rearview mirror. 3 men in uniform standing beside Daniel's grave, Reuben, Ingram, Marino. They had waited until she left. They weren't holding flags. They weren't saluting. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder. Heads bowed. A final watch. Marianne smiled, just faintly. Her son had never been left alone, not in life, and not now. Marianne didn't leave the cemetery right away. She stayed in the car with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching through the rearview mirror as the 3 SEALs approached her son's grave. There was no announcement, no fanfare, no photographer to capture it. But something in the way they moved, measured, quiet, deliberate, told her that this wasn't an afterthought. It was a promise kept to the very end. Reuben stood closest to the grave, with Marino just behind him and Chief Ingram to his right. They didn't speak. They didn't kneel. They just stood there, boots lined evenly on the edge of the grass, their uniforms sharp under the slanting sun. One by one, they stepped forward. Ingram went first. He paused, placed one hand over his heart, then raised the other in a crisp, silent salute. He held it for several seconds longer than custom required, then lowered it slowly and stepped back. Marino followed, younger, still bearing the weight of years he hadn't yet lived. He stepped forward with something clenched in his palm. He opened his hand above the grave and let it fall. A single, worn Navy Challenge coin. It struck the grass without a sound. Then he, too, saluted, eyes locked on the nameplate. Face still in, stepped back. Last was Reuben. He didn't carry anything. He didn't bring a token or coin or folded note. He brought himself. He approached the edge of the grave, stood at full height, then dropped to one knee. Not out of grief, out of respect. He rested his hand gently on the earth, above Daniel's name, and closed his eyes. Marianne watched him whisper something. She couldn't hear it. She didn't try to. But she knew what it meant. He stood again slowly, squared his shoulders, and saluted not just to Daniel's memory, but toward the life he left behind. Toward the woman in the car who had raised him. The one who'd been pushed aside, erased. Almost forgotten except by the one who mattered most. All three men turned together and began walking back down the row of graves, their steps in sync. As they approached the car, Marianne stepped out. She didn't want to meet them from a window. She didn't want to be a bystander to her own son's goodbye. They paused in front of her chief. Ingram was the first to speak. "It's done. He's not alone, never was," she replied. Reuben nodded once. "There's one more thing." He reached into the inner pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a small, creased envelope. It wasn't sealed. It had been opened many times, the paper softened by years of travel. "It's not much," he said, but he carried it everywhere. He handed it to her carefully. Inside was a photograph. Daniel, in full uniform, standing on a dusty base somewhere, far from home. He was holding something in his hands, a small framed picture of Marianne. Her high school graduation photo. "I gave that to him when he left for boot camp," she whispered. "He kept it on every deployment," Reuben said, "even when he wasn't supposed to carry personal items." He made room. Marianne's fingers closed around the picture. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Moreno stepped forward, his voice quiet. "We've stood beside a lot of caskets. Buried. A lot of good men, but this one's different." She looked at him, waiting. "Because he never let us forget where he came from," he said. "And now we won't either." The three SEALs, almost in unison, moved to attention, and then they saluted her. Not the casket, not the church. Her, it wasn't part of any ceremony. It wasn't requested or choreographed. It was instinct, a gesture earned, not by rank or regulation, but by everything Daniel had told them when no one else was listening. Marianne blinked, holding back the well of emotion. But she didn't look away. She accepted the salute with the quiet gravity of someone who had fought a long, unseen battleland was finally being seen. When they lowered their hands, Reuben spoke again. "We're here if you need anything. Always." Then they turned, walked to their truck, and drove away. No headlines. No crowd, just a mother standing in the late afternoon light with a photograph in her hands and the echo of a salute in her chest. And for the first time since her son's death, Marianne felt whole. Not healed, but whole. She had not received the folded flag, but she had received something greater, the truth and the honor that came with it. The local newspaper ran the photo. 2 days later, it wasn't on the front page, not at first. It appeared tucked into the Sunday community section, beneath a headline about a town hall meeting and above a piece about a bake sale for the high school band. But the photo stood out. It showed 3 Navy SEALs standing in a quiet cemetery. Uniforms, immaculate, facing a single grave. No flags, no speeches, no crowd. Just the 3 of them, standing still. The caption read, "A silent farewell. Members of SEAL Team 6 honor a fallen brother." It, Daniel Cooper, at a private visit following his funeral. No one mentioned Marianne by name, but she was there, just barely visible in the frame, a silhouette off to the side. Her figure partially hidden behind a row of headstones, standing apart from the men but facing the same grave. The article accompanying the photo was brief. It mentioned Daniel's service, his death during a classified operation, his funeral at St. Mark's Episcopal Church. It listed the military honors. It noted the names of the SEALs who had attended. It did not mention his mother. But the photo did what the text. It told the story. People noticed. The article made its way across town, first passed between neighbors, folded neatly into purses and lunchboxes. Then it spread wider. A former Navy corpsman reposted it on social media, adding only the line, "This is what brotherhood looks like." By the end of the week, the photo had gone viral. National outlets picked it up. Not because of the ceremony, but because of the stillness, because of the dignity. Because of the woman standing just outside the frame, unseen but unmistakably present, they began asking questions. Who was she? Why wasn't she seated with the family? Why had the mother of a decorated SEAL stood at a distance while others took center stage? At first, Marianne said nothing. She watched the conversations unfold from the privacy of her small home, hundreds of miles from Washington and television studios. The letters Daniel had written still rested in her nightstand. The photo Ruben had given her sat in a simple frame on the kitchen, WINDOWSILL. The flag she didn't have, but the story, her story, was being told now. Not because she forced it, but because someone had finally looked at the full picture. The breakthrough came when a military journalist tracked down Reuben Holt. The reporter asked him about the visit to the cemetery, about the silence, about the salute. Reuben didn't name Marianne, but he said this: "He asked us to make sure someone knew who he really was. Not the officer, not the uniform, the son." The article that followed was titled "The Forgotten Mourners: When Grief is Written Out of the Program." It was quiet, unangry, but it struck a nerve. Other mothers wrote in, sisters, aunts, fathers, who had been sidelined by complicated family politics or new spouses or institutions too eager to streamline grief into something clean and linear. Marianne received letters, emails. A few reporters reached out directly. She declined interviews. She didn't want a camera crew in her yard. But she did reply to the woman from Kentucky whose son had died during training and whose name was omitted from the memorial program. She replied to the retired Army nurse whose daughter's husband never told her about the burial date. She replied to the quiet ones because she understood them, because she had been them. The photo had not been intended as a statement, but it became one, and eventually. The church noticed. St. Mark's issued a statement. It was short, polite, regretful. "We acknowledge that communication errors led to the unintentional exclusion of Lieutenant Cooper's mother from the official proceedings. We offer our deepest apologies and are reviewing our internal processes." It was what institutions always said when they were caught between silence and scrutiny. But it wasn't for them that the photo mattered. It was for the ones who had never so cared. It was for the ones who had never been invited. It was for every mother who waited beside a phone and never got the call. It was for Marianne. One picture, a moment of stillness, 3 men in uniform, and the woman in the shadow who refused to stay forgotten. It arrived by registered mail 3 weeks after the funeral. A single envelope, plain and unadorned, addressed to the Board of Trustees, St. Mark's Episcopal Church. Inside was a typed letter on official Navy letterhead, not from a base, not from a public relations office, but from the legal department of the Department of the Navy. Signed by Rear Admiral Lucille Ortega, JAG Corps. The tone was formal, measured, but unmistakably clear. The letter was not a legal threat. It was something far more unsettling to those who read it. An institutional acknowledgement of failure. It began. Asterisk. We have received multiple communications regarding the funeral proceedings for Lieutenant Daniel Cooper, SN, held at your church on April 6, 2024. We understand that L.T. Cooper's biological mother, Ms. Marianne Cooper, was not notified of her son's death by your office. nor was she allowed to participate in the funeral ceremony organized under your facility's oversight. We write to confirm that this omission occurred in direct violation of Lieutenant Cooper's stated next of kin wishes. Recorded in writing before his final deployment. Asterisk, asterisk, inside the boardroom of St. Mark's. The letter was read aloud by the chairwoman. A woman in her early 60s with a carefully pressed blazer and a stack of minutes from the last meeting sitting in front of her. Around her, the rest of the board listened in increasing discomfort. Several members exchanged glances. One cleared his throat. Another tapped a pen against his folder. None of them had seen this coming. The letter continued. Asterisk, asterisk, while the Navy respects the sanctity of family discretion during memorial planning, it also honors the documented intentions of its service members. Lieutenant Cooper's written instructions. Filed with SEAL Team 6 prior to deployment. Requested that Ms. Cooper be notified immediately upon his death and included in all funeral proceedings. That this did not occur reflects a breakdown not in military protocol, but in civilian partnership. Asterisk, asterisk. The term civilian partnership hung in the air like smoke. It was a polite way of saying you were entrusted with something sacred, then you failed. Further down in the letter was a paragraph that none of them would forget. Asterisk, asterisk, funerals are not merely ceremonial. They are the final point of contact between the living and the dead, between community and memory. To exclude a parent, particularly one named and requested by the deceased, it is a rupture of human dignity. Asterisk, no one spoke after that was read, because that was what had happened. A rupture, not loud, not scandalous, but deep. A kind that reverberated through quiet conversations, through questions whispered by congregants after Sunday service, through a single photo printed in a community column that had somehow reached the Pentagon. They had not expected the photo to matter. They had not expected the men in uniform to respond. They had not expected the mother, uninvited, unlisted, unseen, to become the center of a growing national conversation about who is allowed to grieve and who is quietly erased. The letter ended without threat. There were no demands, no calls for punishment, no requests for public apology, only this asterisk: we ask that you review the circumstances under which this exclusion was permitted to occur, and that you consider how your future policies might prevent such harm. The Navy bears no malice, but we do not forget our own. Respectfully, Rear Admiral Lucille Ortega, asterisk. The meeting ended without a vote, but before everyone left, the chairwoman reached for her phone. She pulled up a number from the church's administrative log. Eliza Cooper. She stared at the name for a long moment, then quietly pressed delete. No announcement, no press release, just the silent removal of the woman's decisions had triggered the entire cascade. The church began rewriting its feudal policy the following week. A new clause was added requiring verified inclusion of all named next of kin from military documents, not just from the family member providing the arrangements. Another clause. Clergy must personally confirm with listed family members before services can be conducted. Under official religious authority, there were whispers that a few longtime donors left the congregation over the changes, but others stayed. More joined. And on a Sunday shortly after, during announcements, the pastor stepped up to the podium and said simply, "We got it wrong, and we're working to make it right." He didn't name Mary Ann. He didn't need to by then. Her name had been written where it mattered most, in her son's letters. And in the silence that followed, when a system tried to forget her and failed, it didn't happen with protest. There was no confrontation, no public fallout, no petitions passed around. The day the church doors closed, truly closed, happened in the smallest of ways. It began with an empty pew. The following Sunday, after the Navy letter, after the photo reached the national papers, and after a word began to spread among the congregation that something had been done, and then undone, people began to pause at the church steps. Some entered slower than usual. Others didn't enter at all. The Cooper funeral had not been the first held at St. Mark's for a local soldier. The congregation had always prided itself on its ties to tradition, on its clean rituals and dignified ceremonies. But now, with every flag draped over a coffin, there was a question no one could unask. Did we remember everyone? That question sat heavier than any hymn. At first. It was the veterans who noticed. A retired Air Force colonel who had served on the church board quietly resigned. No announcement. Just a note left on the secretary's desk with his key inside. The envelope. A Gold Star mother who had sat in the same pew for 15 years stopped attending altogether. When asked why, she simply said, "I can't sit through silence anymore." Then the choir began to thin. Volunteers for the youth. Program pulled back, not in protest. In reflection, it became clear that it hadn't been just an oversight. The funeral exclusion had reflected something deeper, something uncomfortable. The ability of polite institutions to quietly reassign grief, to make it fit within a mold. And when the mold didn't have space for complexity, like an estranged parent or a blended familyette, was the quiet ones who were pushed out. The meeting ended without a vote, but before everyone left, the chairwoman reached for her phone. She pulled up a number from the churches. Administrative log. Eliza Cooper. She stared at the name for a long moment, then quietly pressed delete. No announcement. No press release, just the silent removal of the woman whose decisions had triggered the entire cascade. The church began rewriting its funeral policy the following week. A new clause was added requiring verified inclusion of all named next of kin from military documents, not just from the family member providing the arrangements. Another clause: clergy must personally confirm with listed family members before services can be conducted. Under official religious authority, there were whispers that a few longtime donors left the congregation over the changes, but others stayed. More joined. And on a Sunday shortly after, during announcements, the pastor stepped up to the podium and said simply, "We got it wrong, and we're working to make it right." He didn't name Marianne. He didn't need to by then. Her name had been written where it mattered most, in her son's letters, and in the silence that followed when a system tried to forget her and failed. It didn't happen with protest. There was no confrontation, no public fallout, no petitions passed around. The day the church doors closed, truly closed, happened in the smallest of ways. It began with an empty pew. The following Sunday, after the Navy letter, after the photo reached the national papers, and after word began to spread among the congregation that something had been done, and then undone, people began to pause at the church steps. Some entered slower than usual. Others didn't enter at all. The Cooper funeral had not been the first held at St. Mark's for a local soldier. The congregation had always prided itself on its ties to tradition, on its clean rituals and dignified ceremonies. But now, with every flag draped over a coffin, there was a question no one could unask. Did we remember everyone? That question sat heavier than any hymn. At first. It was the veterans who noticed. A retired Air Force colonel who had served on the church board quietly resigned. No announcement. Just a note left on the secretary's desk with his key inside. The envelope. Gold Star mother who had sat in the same pew for 15 years stopped attending altogether. When asked why, she simply said, "I can't sit through silence anymore." Then the choir began to thin. Volunteers for the youth program pulled back, not in protest. In reflection, it became clear that it hadn't been just an oversight. The funeral exclusion had reflected something deeper, something uncomfortable. The ability of polite institutions to quietly reassign grief, to make it fit within a mold. And when the mold didn't have space for complexity, like an estranged parent or a blended family, was the quiet ones who were pushed out. People had seen Marianne. They had seen the men in uniform stand beside her, and they couldn't forget. Eventually, Eliza Cooper stopped attending services. No one told her to. No one needed to. She arrived one Sunday and found the pew where she had once sat near empty. The woman beside her offered no greeting. The pastor avoided her eye. The folded flag had long since been placed on a shelf in her home. But it had become heavy in a different way. She left mid-sermon and didn't return. The church doors, once bustling with greetings and handshakes, grew quieter. Funerals still happened, weddings, baptisms, but they carried with them the knowledge that something had changed, because the story of Marianne had gone beyond the pews. Other churches reached out, pastors asking for copies of the new funeral. Policy St. Mark's had adopted. Chaplains requesting permission to reprint the Navy letter in newsletters for military families. A Catholic parish 2 counties away rewrote their own protocols after reading the article in Stars and Stripes. And then something no one expected happened. Marianne received a letter, this one not from the Navy, from the church. It wasn't formal. It wasn't from the board, it was handwritten. It's from the pastor, Ms. Cooper. I don't know how to begin except to say I'm sorry. I believed we were doing the right thing when we followed the list we were given. I see now that I should have asked more questions. I should have looked for you. I should have listened to the discomfort in my own silence. Your presence that day changed something in this place. I know you didn't want attention, but you gave us a truth we didn't deserve, and it's still echoing through these walls. Thank you for showing up anyway. In reverence, Rev. Thomas Branch. She folded the letter neatly, placed it in the drawer beside Daniel's letters, and said nothing, because there was nothing else to say. She had already said everything she needed to without raising her voice, without asking to be noticed. And the result had not been chaos. It had been transformation. Not loud, not immediate, but steady. The church doors hadn't closed in defiance. They had closed briefly to rethink who they opened for. And when they opened again, something was different. Not just policy, not just posture, but perspective. Because somewhere between the folded flag and the back row, the church had come to understand the people most worth honoring are often the ones who were never on the program. 6 months had passed since Daniel's funeral. The seasons had turned without fanfare. The summer had softened into autumn, and the heat that once pressed into the West Texas pavement gave way to wind and cooler light. The cemetery had settled. Grass now covered the earth above his grave, green and even, save for the small indentation. Where the soil had settled, a quiet sign of what lay beneath. On the last Sunday of October, the town hosted its annual Veterans Memorial Gathering at the community center, just off the highway. It wasn't a large event, just a few dozen people, mostly older, mostly local, folding chairs, coffee in paper cups. A table of framed photographs lined against one wall black and white portraits from wars no one spoke of anymore. And color. Ones from wars that still hadn't ended. This year, there was something new at the front of the room. Next to the podium where names would be read aloud, a single chair had been placed beside the American flag. It was not part of the seating arrangement for speakers. It was separate, slightly angled toward the audience, holding nothing but a single item laid across the seat. A photograph. Daniel, in uniform, standing in the sun, smiling slightly, holding the framed picture of his mother. Beside the photo, placed gently on the cushion, was a white envelope marked to Mom. No sign, no plaque, no dramatic story. But those who knew the story recognized it instantly. Marianne sat in the front row, not beside the chair, not behind the podium. Just in the crowd, among veterans and spouses and children in small jackets with plastic flags. She wore a plain gray sweater. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. On her left wrist, tucked under her sleeve, was the silver cross Daniel had once carried with him, the one he'd worn under his uniform. The one returned to her by a man who had whispered her name in, at church too late. She hadn't planned to come, But a week before, Reuben Holt had called, not to persuade her, just to let her know the town had quietly added her son's name to the official list of recognized local veterans. It had taken months to process through the red tape, he said. But you should know he's listed now, under survived by his mother, Mary Ann Cooper. So she came not for the crowd, not for a speech, but because this chair, this quiet, deliberate chair was the first space that had been made for her without her needing to fight for it. When the event began, the mayor spoke briefly. A local middle school student read a short poem about sacrifice. Then a young soldier in dress uniform approached the podium and began reading the names. Each name was followed by a pause. Some names were met with nods, others with silent tears. And then Lieutenant Daniel Cooper, United States Navy SEAL. The soldier paused. Then, with practiced formality, survived by his mother, Mary Ann Cooper. The room fell still. Not Mary Ann didn't cry. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. The moment wasn't for mourning, it was for remembering. The kind of remembering that didn't just look backward, but made space in the present. When the names were finished, the crowd was invited to approach the chair, to see the photo, to sit beside it if they chose. Children were gently guided by parents to walk quietly. Veterans removed their hats. A few left coins on the seat beside the frame, a sign of respect. One woman, older, her hand shaking, touched the envelope lightly with 2 fingers, then pressed her hand to her chest. Mary Ann didn't move forward. She didn't need to. The chair was never meant to be hers. It was meant for everyone who had been left out of programs, out of bulletins, out of tidy family summaries. It was for the unseen mourners, the uninvited parents, the quiet heroes whose grief had no headline, but whose love had built everything. Beneath it, as the sun filtered in through the tall community center windows, casting a pale gold light across the polished floor, Mary Ann sat a little taller. The flag stood. The photograph. Watch. And beside them, in silent dignity, the chair remained empty, not from absence, but from reverence.